You know, most of us face different forms of rejection at times. If it's still not happening for us, at least probably happened to some degree during our childhood. Some of us, even though it may not still be happening, the scars can still be seen by others. There are things that have happened that have disempowered us. And did you know that rejection even has the impact? I've discovered in a very recent set of work that actually was taken over a period of 30 years, that it actually massively reduces your IQ ability. In other words, it robs you, it just depowers you of the things that you could do. Rejection is one of those kind of horrible things. You heard the despair in the reading that Jenny gave us earlier from the scripture. Everything is meaningless under the sun in the eyes of the writer at that time. And we want to look at the kind of things tonight. Now, let's think about it for a moment. What kind of behaviour patterns exist for people who operate out of a fear of rejection? What kind of things? I still haven't got my image up on the screen. People who operate out of fear of rejection have these kinds of things happening to them. They display little or no assertiveness. They do not speak up and let others know how they feel about something, especially if their opinions differ from others. Or they go to the other extreme. They speak too much to cover up for who they feel that they are themselves, in a sense of failure that they carry. They function as people who are enablers. They have neither the courage nor the ability to assist others in discontinuing self-destructive behaviour. They support people in their habits of alcohol, drug abuse, underachievement, workaholism, and even though they'll try to help them, they'll be unsuccessful. They'll feel they're doing something, but that's all. It's just making them feel good in some way. They lack the courage of function differently from others, even when they don't enjoy the behaviour in which they are involved. They resort to passive-aggressive behaviour, that is dishonest, sneakiness, and they allow for no real open communication. They would never think of becoming a small group because they don't feel secure, and they don't always admit it. They'll think they're better than others, know more than others, have a greater ability even sometimes. But most people with real rejection don't feel that way, but it still does happen. It's not uncommon. They play games with people. They will keep their personal feelings hidden. They are in tune with what is in and make every effort to emulate it in their lives. They'll try and be the people who are there, but they're not really there. You know, the in-crowd kind of thing. We've watched it over the years with young people. When I was a youth pastor many years ago, you could see certain young people who were trying to be in with the in-crowd, but really it was just a game. It really wasn't real, and it really certainly wasn't who they were. And then they privately express a great deal of anger. They may even express it outwardly, but very deeply inside they will either express anger or depression over how unfortunate and unhappy their current lifestyle is. They will keep saying, I'm going to change it one day, you wait and see. But it's most unlikely to happen. Yet when when helped to look at the alternatives involving confrontation with others, they say they take a yes, but attitude. Yes, I will do it, but it's somebody else's fault, or this, or that, or whatever it is. That's rejection. They are confused as to their true identity. They wear masks with different people. With one lot of people, I'm this nice person. Another lot of people, I'm this angry person. Another lot of people, they might be showing something different. It's all changeable. Some of you might be a little surprised as to how deep your rejection can be. And you may even be in denial of it. Some become so obsessed with functioning, looking and acting in a prescribed manner that they become rigid and flexible and closed to alternative behaviour. This is true even if they are unhappy in the lifestyle that they have been living. They are dishonest with themselves, so much so that it carries over into their interactions with others, and they become habitual liars. That's the way it just happens. That's the way it is. And we need to recognize that rejection isn't only with those that it can be seen in. Things drive us. Some people who are horribly successful in the world are actually quite deeply suffering issues of rejection. They are so driven to try and be something because they don't feel as if they are someone. And so it's a difficult thing that they will struggle with. And I want to say this tonight. We individually are the only ones who can stop the horrendous effects of rejection. You and I are the only ones. And I want to publicly tell you right now that for me as a young man, there were issues, very serious issues of rejection. It doesn't matter how old I get, there are still things that will trigger inside me and I have to battle with. And so whether you do well later in life or not doesn't change the fact that there's still a battle that goes on for us. So I want to start. We're going to have the team come back and do that dance. In my eyes, it can get so cold for a little girl. But God says, in my eyes, you shine so bright. See, what we want to do tonight, and I've come with a pretty gloomy picture initially. What we want to do tonight is we want to look. Now, this isn't working, so. Somebody push a button. We want to look in terms of rejection with dealing with its effects. We want to look at the kinds of things, its causes and effects that it has on us. And it might not be just you that it might be helpful to review this on. It might be much more than that. You see, the reality is that for every one of us, we might need to give each other support. We might need to help others go through the journey. And so when we're looking at this whole rejection deal, let's think about it. You see, let's look at it in terms of its causes and its impact, and how to reject the rejection and change the attitudes of those around you who have fed on your vulnerability if you're a person who's suffering rejection. And you may not understand why you're suffering it, but tonight I hope you discover what it is. You see, there are some trigger points to rejection, some very clear trigger points to rejection. And so I want to quickly go through a bunch of those. The first trigger point I want to talk about is this one: unwanted conception or being an adopted child. I'm the first of one of those. It has huge impact. Do you know that children that are rejected in the womb are affected in their personality? Children that have been adopted for whatever reason, it does affect them. It makes it very difficult to function in some areas of life. It's awful to face rejection. And the consequences of it is that we will be impacted by it. So if you're a person who was an unwanted child, there was an unwanted conception, whatever it is, or if you were born a boy when you were meant to be a girl according to your parents, I always remember a little bit of humour in our family. One of our girls was being born. My mother-in-law was totally convinced it was going to be a boy and bought a whole lot of clothes for them. And I didn't like this thought that my mother-in-law was making decisions about what sex we were going to have. And so I said to Paul, it'd be really funny if we had the opposite sex. It was my sort of sense of humour. And I was quite relieved when we did. Because you see, I think it's important that your child is wanted. And whether we had a boy or a girl didn't really particularly worry me. I was just glad that we're able to have. And my girls, I have no regrets about it. Yeah, it might have been nice to have a boy who worked in the garage. Johanna did her best to try and help me. You know? She knows how to start the lawnmower and she knows how to do all sorts of things. She scared the wits out of me sometimes. I think, oh man. But I've never regretted having girls. But having been on the receiving end of not being wanted, it's pretty difficult. And your parents, if you're a parent and you've had a child you really didn't want, you need to understand that you actually don't realize what you've done. You can pour lots and lots of love on them. But as long as while they were in the womb they're unwanted, it's going to impact them. And you may need to help them address some issue there. Or the adoption issue. Some of you here are adopted. We've got Sailor in our family as part of that cycle. And it hasn't been easy at points for her. It's not going to be easy. There are some who've gone through all sorts of traumas on this level. But it's a trigger point. Let's go to the next one. Childhood experiences. Traumas that children go through. Angry parents, angry teachers, or a neighbour who bullies them. All sorts of things can actually inhibit a person. The rejection can be so extreme that they don't function educationally. They don't function well socially. That's how extreme rejection can be. And some parents now and again wonder why their children do what they do. And, you know, it might not have been the parent's fault. Don't go thinking it's your fault if you're a parent just because your child's struggling with something. There could be some other experience that's been very traumatic. I remember very vividly, my mother was absolutely shocked about 3 years ago when I told her a story I'd recalled when we were children. This traumatized me, this story that was so innocent in a way. We were driving near Rotherham in the South Island. We were going home from my uncle's. My uncle was a severe alcoholic, and the whole family situation had left me feeling very unsettled because of the problems that were there and obviously there in the family. Very young age, children were smoking. In fact, my cousin, who was born the same day as myself, at 21 years old, the day before our birthday, I think it was, she died, throat cancer. And I remember coming away from that situation a little shocked, but a bigger shock was waiting for me. As we drove through the back hills, headed towards Cheviot at the time, there was a glow in the sky. And we got closer and closer to this glow, and we got right up near the glow, and I couldn't believe what I saw. It was only a young boy, a very young boy. Here was this house, a 2-story house, burning. And it was snowing. And for me as a child, snow and fire didn't go together. A house shouldn't burn when it's snowing and it's been raining. Now, I don't know why I thought that, but you might think I'm totally illogical, but I assure you I'm not that illogical nowadays, but I certainly was at this point. My father and mother tried to protect us. So they drove through into a gully that they cut those sort of cuttings in the middle of the road, and there's a little hill, and Dad parked the car and then he ran back. But I remember vividly what I saw. I remember the family dragging furniture out of the house, and some of the family sitting on a sofa watching the fire as the house burnt down, because there was no fire department close to them in those days. In fact, it turned out they had no telephone, and the only vehicle they had in this family, which was a very poor family on the farm, my mother recently told me, was a tractor. It's the only vehicle they had. And that certainly wasn't going to race you to the local town to get you rescued. So they just pulled the furniture out and watched it burn down. You know what that did to me? For night after night after night after night after night, I redreamed that, and I dreamed myself in that house. And it wasn't until years and years later that I started feeling secure about living in a house when it snowed. That's ludicrous, you'd say. But the traumas don't need to make sense. And sometimes those traumas are there. So they're childhood experiences. Or even, often in your childhood, but not necessarily in childhood, this happens in adulthood too, traumatic experiences of rejection. For example, nicknames. Nicknames taken from Old Nick, in other words, from Satan, by the way. That's what it literally means. Old Nick, Satan. These kinds of things actually happen, you know. These ones, you're told you're dumb. You're told you're ugly or useless or whatever. You got 4 eyes if you happen to have to wear glasses when you're a child. You're whitey or darky. Now, you've got to take this one on board here. When we first came to Porirua, I was used to the kind of thing where people with coloured skin in Christchurch were called darkies because there were very few of them. So kids in school were meanly treated sometimes, and if you had a coloured skin, that's what kids did. Now, I didn't like it. I always felt uncomfortable with it. But we came up here, and Pauline turns up in the class to pick up Adele. And Adele had been at school about half a year before we came, and she was 5 years old. And Pauline comes up the class, and she sort of comes to the door, and school should have finished, but for some reason hadn't quite finished. The teacher hadn't finished with the children. And the teacher turns to Adele and says, "Adele, your mother's here." And Pauline's standing there and thought, how does she know I'm Adele's mother? She couldn't figure it out at first. Then suddenly it dawned on her. Adele was the only white child in the class. You know? But then Adele went through this incredible trauma here where the kids were picking on her. So she didn't want to go to school. She wanted homeschooling or whatever. And so I decided I'd go to school with her. So I told Adele to walk in front of me. I walked to school with her, and then when she went through the gate, she walked in front of me. So she's a little distance ahead. And as we walked through, these kids were standing there going, "Whitey, whitey, whitey, whitey." Oh, no, darky, whitey. You know, it made sense, didn't it? You were different to me. That's all it was saying. But it became injurious, and Adele didn't really want to go to school at that point. Well, I went up and I patted some kids on the head, which is culturally not appropriate. But I thought, to hang with this cultural appropriateness. I'm not very good at PC, as most of you know. So I patted them on the head and said, "That's not very nice, is it?" I said, "How would you like it if you were the only little brown child in the school and they all called you Darky?" Eyes were big and at me, and, you know, just about floating like saucers, and they got at me. Terrified, these kids were. I said, "Well, you know, don't do it again. That'd be nice, and you can have lots of fun at school." And I wandered off. Adele told us the next few days she was the popular girl. They suddenly realised that she had long hair, she was the only white one, and they could plait her hair if they wanted to. And she used to sit there and they used to play with her hair. I mean, all the others, their hair was too curly to plait like that. You know? I mean, you go through these things, and then there's fatty or skinny or whatever it happens to be. And it actually has no relevance to the size of the person sometimes. And even if it does, it's unfair. Nerd. If you happen to be bright, you get called nerd. That's a real rejection issue. And then this one here, where Johanna got so angry one day. A young boy in the school who came from this area, and we used to take him to school each day. And the teacher called him poor boy. That was her way of trying to deal with this child who was being a little bit impossible. Yes, they were being impossible. But it stung, and it really was intended to sting, and that kid was going through enough rejection in his life without that. So Johanna, in her little justice coat she would wear sometimes, rises up and challenges a teacher, and you can't call people that. She was right. We went through a whole deal. We had to meet with the DP and the teacher and all the rest of it. And the teacher actually had to apologize to the boy in the end. You know? Because that kind of rejection can be so powerful. When I was a child, one of the things that happened to me at a certain time of the year, I would get this little rash on the lobes of my ears. It would spread across my ears, it would go down my whole body, and I'd be covered in this rash, an eczema type thing. It happened year after year after year after year, and they couldn't figure out what it was. Now, if they'd bothered to look back at their files, they would have suddenly realized what it was, because it was me that discovered what it was in the end by sheer accident. I was at work, and it was still happening, my second year at work, and it all came all over my body, and there was a fear that it might have some contagious element to it, which was ludicrous, because now I know what it was. It wasn't possible. And so here I was, off work, for the safety of everybody. But every year it happened, it used to last a long time, and nobody could figure out why. Until this particular year, I decided I was at work, and I was still young at heart, and I still am. So I decided I'd fly kites. And I was laying in the grass. And I noticed as I was laying in the grass, it got worse. Went to the doctor. Doctor did some tests. And it discovered, after all these years of me suffering, and kids teasing me because of it every time it happened, all those years, I'm allergic to new green grass. Would you believe it? You know? Boy, those kind of things can cause rejection issues, you know that? Now I can look back and laugh at it now, but boy, it wasn't so easy sometimes. What about this one? Playground exclusion. Playground exclusion. Oh, the number of times when kids get excluded in the playground for all sorts of reasons. And when you move from school to school to school to school, and you move 6 schools in just over 2 years, I can tell you about playground exclusion. Because the kids have already made their friends, and they don't make new ones very easily. It's hard work. I was a cheeky little brat and used to sort of break in on it sometimes, but never mind. Trigger points. The next one. Physical conditions that makes a person believe that it makes them unattractive to others. Like my eczema, but there's other physical conditions that people have. People can be convinced because their toes cross, they've got knobbly knees, and somebody tells them they've got knobbly knees. They're no different to somebody else's knees, but somebody says one day, "Oh, you've got big knobbly knees." Or "You've got big ears." "You've got a funny shaped nose." I was stunned some years ago when we were asked to run this event for this missions group. There were 61 missions involved in it. And they asked us to simulate living in a 20 years or so, or 30 years, whatever it was, in advance of the date we were at the time. And that we were asking people to come into this village that we created, and it was an autocratic society. You know how we threw people really badly? We had to throw them badly so that when they came in, their life experience, it was a life experience thing, they call it simulation. We needed to throw all their paradigms so they didn't feel comfortable and relaxed. We wanted to throw them so seriously that they'd come in there and feel totally intimidated by the experience. And we'd try and bring the worst out in them so that we could teach them how to live better. That was the idea. Well, there was a group of us, Gaynor and Vernon and Rosella and myself. We sat down and came up with these ideas. You know the thing that threw people most, that stunned us? We drew on this little card that was put into a computer slot shapes of noses. And we drew different shapes of different noses. And we called the ones that society normally calls ordinary, ugly. And the ones that society normally calls ugly, they were stylish. And I can't remember all the names. It went through a grade, I think, of about 5 different types of noses. There were people who got angry at us over this. They got really angry. My nose is perfectly all right. How dare you write on this thing that it's ugly? It worked. It's through their paradigms because, you see, it's all relative. It has nothing to do with truth. Nobody's nose was genuinely ugly. Some of you might say, well, I've got a nose that looks like a bus has run over it. Well, some people have got a nose that looks like they got it caught in the keyhole. So what? It's all relative. There's nothing bad about anybody's nose. I've got a great nose. You might not think so, but it works for me. You see, that's the truth. You see, we get caught up in these things, but it has the power to rob us, doesn't it? Yes? There's all sorts of things. I know that one of the things that a lot of rugby guys live with for the rest of their lives is the frustration of people labelling them. Who in the rugby team gets labelled on this issue? Sorry? Yeah, the hookers, props. I mean, that's one of the things. And some of them don't actually cope with it as they get older. They try to protect themselves from getting it when they're younger by wrapping head bandages around all sorts of crazy things, because they're very aware of how powerful these kind of images can be. The next one, the lack of appropriate role models in people's lives can create rejection. For example, a lack of a good mum or a good dad or trustworthy friends. When we've got to turn to people who are not trustworthy, who are not healthy for us, it's going to be destructive. When a dad or a mum is absent or is not functioning well, is hooked into alcoholism, hooked into some type of obsession, or an angry person, or suffering huge rejection issues themselves, it's going to have huge impact. Or if we lose a mum or dad, and of course it's compounded for those who are adopted because they've lost a mother or father. It's very difficult. So that's another rejection issue. What about this one here? The lack of social skills. And usually this lack of social skills, some people say it comes about because of rejection. In actual fact, that can be true, but sometimes the rejection comes about because they haven't been taught good social skills. My father was obsessed with this kind of thing, and he would always watch people. And one of my uncles, he used to get mad with every time this uncle came to eat with us, because this particular uncle, he didn't eat like everybody else was trained to in the family for some reason. Or all of us in the family were trained to eat like this. If you open your mouth and you eat like this, you were a target for my father. If you're a kid and you did it, the knife would go bang across your hand. You would keep your mouth closed. I can tell you, there are social skills that people lack for all sorts of reasons. And it might be social skills on etiquette. It might be social skills on how I can communicate with others. It might be social skills that when I'm talking, I don't do this certain things, If I'm going to have a discussion with somebody, I don't go and say, "Hello, Marilyn, I'm going to talk to you." You see, they are often rejection issues. That's people trying to say, "I want to communicate," but doing it in a way that's destructive. So there's all sorts of lacks of social skills, and we haven't got the time to go into all of them, but most of us have probably slipped up in some areas. Then the next one. When your self-image is too closely tied to what others think. When your self-image is too closely tied to what others think. If your self-image is too closely tied to what others think of you or how well you relate to others, then fear of rejection can be a threat to your whole self-image. That in itself can create a lot of anxiety. If you're used to defining the core of yourself or your future as popular, married, well-liked, a leader or the like, and threats to any of these self-concepts may create a great deal of anxiety. Or you may view your life script as being married, having children, or having a number of close friends. To the degree that any of those expectations are threatened and you cannot see how you can be happy without them, then you will experience anxiety, and it's an expression of rejection. So how can you overcome fear of rejection? Due to the threat of your self-image or your life script that you've formed not working out the way you want it to. You need to look at those kinds of things. You see, really the self-image one has to do with the word insecurity. And you can see in this group of people, this guy here is looking pretty much disturbed because everybody else, he feels like they're all talking about him. I know of a situation several years ago where somebody I knew very well got very, very, very upset because people were talking about them. The thing is, I was in such an awkward position because I knew what they were talking about. They were arranging a birthday party for the other person. But their rejection issue took them so powerfully that they feared that the people were actually being destructive to them. In actual fact, it wasn't the case. Insecurity can rob us absolutely and totally. It can rob us absolutely and totally. And the next one, self-attitudes. I'm no good, and it can be triggered by other things, but sometimes I've seen families where they've been given so much support, they've not had anything negative said to them, they've been given all sorts of advantages in life that other people haven't, but they feel absolutely bad about themselves. I have a friend some years ago who in actual fact, if he really did have a good way of looking at his life objectively, would have seen how well he'd done in life, but he chose to suicide because he felt so bad about himself. He chose to suicide. That's a pretty gutting experience when it's somebody you know well. And then the next one is being insecure in their personal identity with a debilitating lack of self-confidence. Being insecure in their personal identity with a debilitating lack of self-confidence. If we have a lack of good self-identity, we will fail, and we will fail miserably, and we'll feel the impact of our failure in all sorts of ways. I want to look at some steps now to overcome the fear of rejection and the issue of rejection. And I want to just go through one or two little stories to very briefly. You might recognize some of these. A teenager's low popularity convinced her that she was not attractive. She became, however, a top fashion model, hailed by many as the most beautiful woman in the world. All those who had ignored her are now boasting that they had gone to school with Claudia Schiffer. Some of you may not know her. Did I pronounce her name right? However you pronounce it. You know her. Some of you do. You've aspired to look like her. You'll never make it. Only haven't you? Oh, come on. Especially you guys. You're not going to do it, All right. Rejected as too awkward and clumsy to be a ball boy in a Davis Cup tennis match. He was rejected just to be the ball boy. Okay? Stan Smith went on to become the officially ranked number one tennis player in the world in 1972 and 1973. He was too clumsy to be a ball boy. He'd never play tennis, said one of the guys. He overcame that rejection. Would-be crime novelist John Creasy received an unbroken succession of 743 rejection slips. There's a big rejection issue. Wouldn't you agree? 743 rejection slips. Over 60 million of his books have now been published. Boy, 60 million books, 473 rejection slips. Doesn't seem very big now, does it? But I bet everyone that came, it was hard. Some of you have suffered rejection from not being accepted for jobs or whatever. What will they send me next, said Edmund Hillary's gym instructor of the puny schoolboy now known as the man who conquered Mount Everest. What will they send me next about this puny boy? Sir Edmund Hillary. He wasn't to be rejected. Then balding skinny can dance a little, said one of the dance instructors. They said it of Fred Astaire at his first audition. He can only dance a little. One of the top dancers in the secular world. Beethoven's music teacher declared him hopeless at composing. Wonder who the music teacher was. We don't even know who they were, do we? Albert Einstein's parents feared he was subnormal. Abnormal maybe, but not subnormal. This is an interesting story. You may not have heard of this one. Mentally backward Max Raffler loved to paint. Over the years, as his paintings piled over even higher and higher in the house, his sisters would burn them to make room for more. Finally, when an old man, his artistic ability was finally recognized. The well-meaning sisters had destroyed an estimated amount of tens of millions of dollars worth of paintings. Rejection from your sisters. It was the dead of night. A shadow slunk down the street. It was Charles with the Dickens of a problem. He was off to mail his manuscript, huddling his guilty secret, petrified lest friends find out and ridicule him. The manuscript was rejected. More rejections pierced him before he won the hearts of millions with such classics of Oliver Twist. Billy Graham preached a missionary's Billy Graham preached, a missionary's daughter battled an almost uncontrollable urge to run out of the meeting. This young missionary's daughter. It was his future wife, and it wasn't conviction that made her squirm. It was her response to what she considered appalling preaching. He's the most famous preacher in the world, guys. Oh, whoa. Okay. Said Professor Eramus Wilson of Oxford University, I think I may say without contradiction that when the Paris exhibition closes, the electric light will close with it and no more will be heard of it. Now, what a failure. Edison had it all over him. An invitation was extended to witness one of humanity's most historic moments. The Wright brothers sent out an invitation for their first flight in their, what they called, heavier-than-air machine. 5 people turned up to see it. Rejection. But see, rejection does not mean we can't have success. Amen? You see, rejection does not mean we can't have success. And we want to come to that place. See, what I want to say tonight is, whether you see yourself as gifted or unusual, indispensable or inadequate, depends entirely on the frame of reference that you choose. It depends entirely on the frame of reference you choose. Anybody else can do what they like to you, but if you choose the right frame of reference, those things will have absolutely no power over you. And I want to suggest one really important thing. From God's frame of reference, the life's work He has chosen for you, no one else is as perfectly endowed as you. God has chosen you as the best person. You look at all the stories we just related just now. Think about them. Who would be crazy enough to do 11,000 light bulb filaments before they got one to glow? Who would be mad enough to do that? Only Edison. Uniquely endowed, stubborn as, he insisted on pursuing all the way through. See, if we're looking at rejection, then we need to look at the other side, the other opportunity, because the rejection doesn't need to be our possession. It doesn't need to be our life. Here's the side, I reckon we need to wipe it out, and let's pick up this side. This is one of the psalmists wrote these words. He said, praise be to God who has not rejected my prayer or withheld his love from me. God will never reject you. It doesn't matter what man has done. And you don't need to suffer rejection from God. So I want to give some steps that might be helpful to each one of us. The first step is decide whether or not you operate out of a fear of rejection. Some of you may not do so, but I would suggest that a lot of us do have little issues, if not bigger issues. You can stand on your head with it, but you need to look at it seriously. The second step I would suggest is that you identify the person or persons from whom you fear rejection. Identify them. And I'm not suggesting that Chris and Philip are other people. A little chuckle came from Philippa down here. You know, you need to identify from whom they come. And it's helpful to identify them, because when you identify them, if you're very logical about it, it'll actually help you see a different perspective of what you may have received in the past. The third step, identify how your fear of rejection is displayed in your behavior towards the people you identified in step 2. So what it's saying is identify how your fear of rejection is displayed in your behavior toward the people you identified in step 2. How do you behave around those people that you've received rejection from? Because that'll tell you a lot about what you need to fix up. It will. I don't know about you, but when I was young, I got into trouble a little bit at school. And we were at Porirua Town School in Blenheim. And the headmaster had a big throat that came down here like this. And we called him Bullfrog one day. And we're all talking about Bullfrog. And that afternoon, of all days for it to happen, I got invited to his office. And I went there in absolute fear and trembling, because people in authority was something that I was very, very, very scared of as a child, because of my relationship with my father and some other issues that gone there. And I was totally convinced that somehow Bullfrog, and I don't know what his real name was, I'm sorry. I thought he knew I'd called him Bullfrog. I was convinced that when I got in there, I was going to get the strap for calling him Bullfrog. I can tell you what happened to me. I walked in that office. I almost wet myself. I was terrified when he opened his mouth. He was going to say, "Now, Gary Colville, you have been a very bad boy and you're going to get 6 of the best." And that terrified me. However, it so happened that I had actually forgotten that I'd done extremely well in swimming the mile. And the headmaster wanted to say something nice to me. Now, what could have happened there if I'd reacted badly and hadn't turned up and I'd done all sorts of bad behaviour things? I very nearly did. I've got to be honest with you. I wasn't coping too well at all. But the way we behave around certain people will influence us. You know, years and years and years later, I was an adult at Bible college and I was invited to the principal's office. All those same fears came back to me. They have incredible power over us, things that have happened in our past. Incredible power. So we need to identify what it is. And authority figures used to intimidate me. And it was a guy called Peter McNee, who, after I'd run the life experience I talked about, the simulation I talked about earlier, who sat me down afterwards and said, "Gary, you have an issue in your life." He said, "You need to learn to go and tackle the people at the top and don't work through the minions at the bottom. He said, you did so much extra work you didn't need to do. And if you'd done these things," and I sat and I thought about it afterwards and realized why I never went to the people at the top. It's because I feared them. Because my rejection issue had put me in a position where I preferred to work with the little guy who I felt as if I might get some chance of communicating with. The big guys to me were scary. And Peter helped me work through that issue, and it was a great lesson to be learnt for me. The fourth step, identify healthy, productive and rational alternative behaviour patterns to those identified in step 3. Now, let me say this. When I say this, identify healthy, productive, and rational alternative behaviour patterns, there's some people in the room who have a subjective type personality and you're doing the rational thing. It has nothing to do with rational stuff. Let me tell you. Everybody's capable of doing this. In fact, some people who are rationals are less capable of doing this than some people who are subjective by nature here. Can I say that? And help you to realize that sometimes people who are rational by nature are disempowered because of their rejection issues. And so all of us here are in the same boat. And we can identify healthy and productive and rational alternative behaviour patterns, and we can put them in place. So what do I have to do? When I face people in authority, I can treat them with respect. I wanted to have fun, and I wish today I had some fun. Years ago, our mayor, when we first came to Porirua, the mayor invited Pauline and myself to go and have a cup of tea with him. That was really nice. We never did end up having our cup of tea with him, because a couple of days later, suddenly they rang up. I think they rang, did they, Paul? It was delayed. We never did have it though, did we? Oh, it was postponed. I forgot we had the cup of tea now. It makes me feel worse, but never mind. You know what happened? We got this communication that said, however the communication came, sorry, unable to have the cup of tea with you. The Queen was coming. And I wanted to write back. I joked with Pauline. I wanted to write back, that's all right, invite her. I should have. Looking back at it. Because that would have been a very constructive thing for me to do. You know, you can think of all sorts of creative, fun things you can do. Can you just for a moment imagine the consequences if you put a totally different behaviour in place and you chose to do it? Can you imagine the consequences? I can, because they've happened for me. I'm not perfect yet, but I'm certainly on the journey and I'm enjoying it immensely. Amen? Step 5, identify what obstacles other than your fear of rejection might be in place. And it might not, because sometimes we think, I've got a rejection issue, but there actually may be other things that are pure obstacles to us. We may not be able to do that job because we just don't have an academic ability to do that job. Or we may not be able to do that job because we get bored out of our brains doing that job, whatever it is. But we need to make sure that we don't think it's rejection when in actual fact it's not rejection at all. So, identify that. The next one, point 6, and we're just about near the end. Analyze the obstacles listed in step 5, I've got that wrong, and identify whether there are rational beliefs or actual obstacles to change. And then, if in the event that you've done this analysis, implement alternative behaviour patterns not based on your fear of rejection. What you've got to do, let's take a practical example. For example, if for years and years and years you've lived under resentment, rejection, because when you're a child you wore glasses at school, and of course you probably, if you were my age, you probably were issued with health department glasses, which were not very complimentary, and kids used to love to pick on other kids. I can tell you the number of people I've counselled over the years where that was actually an issue that actually impacted them. In fact, one of my elders in Colville, he had that issue when he was at school, and he also had the issue that his mother, who raised him on her own, had a difficult time in those days to do that. His mother actually used to dress him in clothes that were 15 to 20 years out of date. And Lloyd openly shared this in the church, so I do feel free to say it to you. Lloyd found that he was depowered by that whole series of instances in his life, and it meant that he didn't function well, and he was very conservative and withdrawn in nature. And when I turned up, I rattled the bones out of the poor old guy. And he wasn't young, he was retired at the time. And I said to Lloyd, I want you to, as an elder of the church, I want you to come over and I want you to pray for people when you come out of baptism. Oh, I couldn't do that, says Lloyd. Why couldn't he? When we talked about it, it was because of the impact that the stuff in his childhood had. It had left him with a lack of confidence and a lack of ability to actually trust God. So we get there, and I thought, well, it's up to you, bro. I'm not going to argue theology with me, because he had theological reasons to not do it as well. You see, he had all these reasons, which people always come up with ideas why they shouldn't do something. It's easy to run excuses past yourself and others. And so in any case, we had the baptismal in the middle of the floor, not up on a stage, but in the middle of the floor, and here's the baptismal here. And this lady was being baptized, and I was in the baptismal with this lady, and the old Lloyd, he got down there beside it, and Kevin, the other elder on the other side, and kind of an exciting environment, and here we were there, and he knelt down, and then I noticed he put his hand out. I was peeking. You're allowed to peek. They must have peeked in the Gospels, otherwise they wouldn't have been able to tell us the whole story, so... And he put his hand out over. He never, ever put his hands and laid hands on. This is the thing I asked him to do. And then he prayed. And he starts his prayer of, "Dear Lord, I pray." And I thought, oh no, here goes one of these traditional prayers again. Boy, did I need a smack in the jaw from God. Because the moment I said it, God dealt me a blow. Because what happened, he says, "And the Lord says to you, my daughter," and he spoke in ordinary English. No more highfalutin prayer. And he had this word of knowledge over this woman. It was so powerful. She was weeping in the baptismal because he revealed stuff that none of us knew. In the detail, he revealed it. And she hadn't told anybody, and God spoke to her right there in the baptismal, and she was a changed woman. I can tell you what happened to Lloyd after that. Every morning we used to pray together on the phone, and his rejection issue, he was struggling with trying to battle with it, and he knew he had to do something. Every morning he rang me for prayer, because I managed to convince him we should pray on the phone. That was difficult because of his rejection stuff. Praying on the phone was just not spiritual. But it was nothing to do with spiritual stuff. It was to do with the rejection issue. And so the phone would ring, and I'd pick it up, and I'd say, "Morning, Lloyd." And I would say, "Gary, did it really happen?" For over 2 weeks, he asked me that question every morning. Did it really happen? Yes, I said, "Lloyd, God used you." And I'll never forget the change in that man's life. It was so powerful. He went around, and all these people were in awe of the man. He was tall already, but they were in awe of him. He was the first guy on site to set up the Tasman Pulp and Paper Mill. He was no fool. He'd been in the Treasury Department, and I'd nicked him to get him to do this financial deal, setting the whole thing up. Lloyd was there, and God was using him. So much so that Lloyd and I had some real laughs over it. One day in the middle of a service, Lloyd comes up to me and whispers something to me, and then he goes back and sits in the seats, and we had some very, very spiritual people in the church, a little bit hyper-spiritual if anything, and they come up to me afterwards and said, "What did Lloyd say to you, Gary? Was it a word from God?" Actually, it's been a joke ever since for those of us who know. He actually, he never did this again. He had never done it before. In the middle of a service, a very serious moment, I don't know what inspired him to do it, he came up and told me a joke. I daren't tell these spiritual people, they wouldn't have coped with it. But he would never have had the courage to do that before. His rejection thing would have kept him in his seat, and he would have, if I move from here, God might get me. You see, God wants us to be free, and He doesn't want us to be inhibited. And telling a joke in the middle of service was fine, as long as you don't do it while I'm preaching. I mean, okay. So we can implement things. I want to finish with this last one. I think we need to be people who are going to live our lives for an audience of one. And the audience of one I want to suggest is the living God, who says He will never reject us, who says He won't put us aside, who says He wants the best for us, who has the ability to give all that He says He wants, and He wants us to know the power of His presence every day, working in us and through us for the benefit of other people in our community and beyond. Now, I cannot imagine anything more honourable than that God should want to do that for me, because I deserve to be rejected in God's eyes because of what I've done. But he chooses to say, no, sweep that all aside. I don't reject you. I love you. And he loves every one of us. And I want to say, all those other points will come to nothing if we don't live the way we're designed to live. And the one who designed us has real intention for us. See, God has intention that's so clear. There's the two scriptures that talk about it like this. It says, for I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future. That doesn't sound like rejection, does it? And the next one, which was meant to come up separately, but it's done a wally on me. Do not let your hearts be troubled. Trust in God. Trust also in me. Why did Jesus say it? Because the disciples who heard him speaking like this already knew what it was like to be walking around with him and trusting him. Because every time he told them to go and do things and people would be healed and there'd be miracles happen and all the other things, they could rely on him. And when Jesus spoke those words, they knew he meant exactly what he said. And they knew that to rely on what he said was going to leave them feeling secure because they had never, ever felt so secure. Tax collector. A tax collector who was rejected by the people, considered to be a horrible person, who when he got thoroughly touched by God, what did he do? He says, God, all the money deal stuff which has been so important in my life, if I've robbed anybody, I'm going to pay them 4 times back what I took. Boy, is that dealing with rejection issues. Big rejection issues. So live our lives for an audience of one, and I couldn't give you any other better thing to finish with than to say that. And I'm going to ask the dance team, to come up and to do this dance once again for us. And I want you to think about the words, because it'll help you think differently about the words this time as you hear the words, as they're sung, and as the girls dance it for us. Let's welcome them back up here. There's some sheets here with the root causes of rejection by a guy called Noel Gibson. Noel's a good friend of mine, and I think if any of you would like to take copies of this, you're very welcome. I've got enough copies for most people here, if not all of you. If I haven't, I can do some more. And that just might be helpful for you to reflect on. I'm just going to leave them on, I'll leave them on the floor, otherwise the girls might slip on them. Let's drop the house lights and let's watch this and appreciate what God's doing here. I'd invite you to talk with God with me right now. People call it prayer. And if you want to say you agree with what I've prayed, then at the end of it, I'm going to say all the people said, and you can say amen. And if you mean it, you tell us afterwards. Because God wants us to know how precious this is. In His eyes, He makes us and He sees us white. There's no impurity, there's no destructive stuff, because His ideal is much greater than who we are. Let's talk to Him. Father God, we come to you now. Lord, we don't understand why you wouldn't reject us, because we've even rejected ourselves quite often. We've allowed the controls of other people to disempower us and leave us with feelings of rejection. Lord, forgive us for giving them so much power and taking away the power from you that you have given to us to live a life that's so different. We want to live for you as the audience of one, and we're sorry for the times we haven't done that. And it's just such an awesome thing that you would never reject us if we just simply accept what you've done for us. And so we want to say thank you today. And we want to receive that love and that forgiveness and the freedom that you offer each one of us here. In Jesus' mighty name. And they all said? Amen. And they all said? Amen. Hey, let's show a great deal of appreciation. We've got our team at the back, a wonderful team on the stage. Lots of people done lots of work now. Cafe Zana's available if you'd like a coffee or tea. Now you can go out the back there and enjoy it, and feel free to hang around. And Lord bless you. Have a great week.